Anytime I see a patient that has suffered a concussion, I always start out by asking them the same question. That being, has anyone ever explained to you what happens to your brain when you sustain a concussion? Or do you just have a general idea of what happens? And I'm always surprised that most patients have no idea. The reason I find this extra surprising is because most of my patients are not coming to see me immediately following their concussive event. The average person that I see for concussion is at least a year post injury. And in that year, they've usually been to and tried a number of different treatment options, and yet still nobody has sat down with them and explained what actually occurs within the brain after a head injury. So in this video, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share with you what happens when you hit your head. Starting off with the 50,000 foot view of what occurs to your brain when you bump your noggin on someone or something. Then we'll zoom way in and talk about the various things that take place at the cellular level. First up, let's define some terms. According to the 6th International Conference on Concussion in Sport, they define concussion as a traumatic brain injury caused by a direct blow to the head, neck, or body, resulting in an impulsive force being transmitted to the brain. This distinction is crucial because many patients mistakenly believe a concussion can only occur if they hit their head. However, as this definition highlights, it just has to be a force that's transmitted to the brain. So whether it's an impact to your head or body from a motor vehicle accident or the shock waves from a blast injury while in combat, any force that is transmitted to the brain can cause this type of injury. Now, if we were to look at the brain, I think most people, when thinking about concussion, envision something kind of like this, where the brain moves within the skull, hitting the inner walls and bouncing from one side to the next. And that does happen, no doubt about it. That's what we call a coup counter coup injury. But something I also want you to take into consideration is the shape of this brain and the shape of the skull in which that brain sits. They're both kind of round. So whenever your brain moves around within the skull, it isn't just going to move in one direction, absorb all that shock, and then move in the other direction. What will actually happen is, considering the fact that both of these structures are round-ish, when the brain moves around within the skull, it will hit and rotate as the shape of the brain conforms to the shape of the skull, and then as it comes back in the other direction, again, it will hit and rotate some more. This then leads to stretching and shearing forces and torsional forces to be displaced throughout the brain. Think about it kind of like a wet towel. If you were to wring out a wet towel, which part undergoes the most amount of tension? It's obviously going to be the center part, right? That center would get wrung out the most, and the same thing applies to our brain. If again, we look at the brain, if we look at the brain itself, we have the brain up top and then the brainstem, and then the brainstem transitions into the spinal cord, which anchors down to our pelvis. So now imagine that you have this long rope that extends from your brain down to your pelvis. And so whenever you sustain some sort of concussive event, your brain moves about within the skull, and the midline region of your brainstem undergoes the most amount of stretching and shearing forces just because the area in which it sits. I emphasize that because there are quite a few important areas that reside within that midline region of your brainstem. Your eye movement centers live there, as well as the areas that regulate your heart and your breathing. And one area that is really important in regards to lingering post-concussion symptoms is called the vestibular nuclei. The vestibular nuclei's main job is to relay a signal to the brain about what your location is in space. This is the most fundamental question that your brain is always asking, that being, where am I? This is because humans are designed to move, and in order to move, I have to know where I'm physically located. Imagine this scenario with me. If you were to load up in your car and head someplace that you've never been, you'd probably need to recruit the help of your GPS. So let's say that you punch in the destination of wherever you're heading, but in order to get to that destination, your GPS has to know where you currently are. It makes a big difference if you're here in Colorado Springs or in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. If your GPS doesn't have your current coordinates, you might as well just throw a dart at a map and hope for the best. This is the job of the vestibular nuclei. The vestibular nuclei receives its information from three different sources, those being your inner ear, aka your vestibular system, your proprioceptive system, which is all the feedback from your muscles and joints, and lastly, from your visual system. I'm not going to go into depth in this video how each one of these systems work, but I want you to understand that each one of these systems ideally is working together in harmony for us to navigate this world. They work together just like a team of folks on a job site. Let's say me, you, and Jimbo are working together on this job site, and each of us have our own jobs to do to contribute to this job getting done on time. Well, let's say that Jimbo calls in sick one day. All of a sudden, you and I are going to have to work a little bit harder to make up for Jimbo being out so that we don't end up falling behind schedule. The same thing applies to the brain and those three systems that we just spoke about. If one of those systems becomes impaired, the other two will now have to work a little bit harder. And depending on which system is impaired, will dictate not only what symptoms you're presenting with, but more importantly, what the appropriate treatment will be. Depending on the combination that you have of which system or systems are impaired and which ones are now compensating, will decipher whether or not you have dizziness or a headache or visual motion sensitivity or brain fog. The list goes on and on. Now, let's narrow things down even further and discuss what takes place at the cellular level. This process is collectively called the neurometabolic cascade. Your brain is made up of a bunch of neurons, and those neurons have various molecules around and even within them. Typically, there's a lot of sodium molecules on the outside of the neuron and potassium molecules on the inside. Now, this may start to get a little complex, so try and follow me because I think it's really important. When a neuron receives a signal and then wants to send that signal down the line to the next, for example, when I think about moving my hand, neurons within my brain will then send signals down to the appropriate muscles to contract the muscles required to make whatever this movement may be. But this process doesn't just magically take place. When one neuron wants to speak to another neuron, those molecules have to switch places. The stuff on the outside comes in and the stuff on the inside goes out. Kind of like whenever you were a kid and your parents needed to have a grown up talk, they stepped out of the room for a little privacy. Now, tying that 50,000 foot view that we spoke on earlier into this concept, when you hit your head and all those shearing and stretching forces are displaced throughout the brain, this process here takes place. Stuff on the outside comes in and stuff on the inside goes out. And this makes it to where now millions of neurons think that they just received a signal and then begin to spontaneously fire. Kind of like the old game of telephone. Once someone tells me the secret word or phrase, I then pass that message along to the next person in the chain. Now, I know we're getting kind of in the weeds a little bit. So, what does this have to do with you and your recovery from this concussion? Great question. Well, when these molecules switch places, they basically just go on a little vacation, meaning that they need to come back to where they initially came from. Just like if you were to go on vacation, eventually you have to come back home. And this process requires energy. Hence, why concussion patients typically feel very tired, and why sometimes their symptoms can be getting worse for the first few days because all that energy is being utilized to get those sodium and potassium molecules back to where they originally came from. According to the literature, most individuals are symptom free within a week or two. But important note, just because you're symptom free does not mean that you have recovered from a concussion. For example, in a recent study, they took 40 concussed athletes and they measured their brain metabolism over a 30-day period using some fancy technology called magnetic resonance spectroscopy. And they state that at 30 days post injury, all athletes showed complete recovery, having metabolite ratios return to values detected in controls. However, athletes self declared symptom clearance between 3 and 15 days after concussion. This is where concussion patients can get themselves into trouble because they return to their sport once they become symptom free, but before this neurometabolic cascade has had enough time to return your energy levels back to baseline. I think about it kind of like paying off debt. If your credit card's maxed out and you throw a little bit of money at it, you pay down that debt and now you have a little bit of credit to use, but interest is still accruing in the background. Ideally, we pay that bill in full every month and avoid paying the outrageous interest fees. So if you were within that period, the period where you're symptom free but your energy levels have not yet returned to baseline, you now run the risk of dropping your energy levels even lower than they did after the initial impact, because it's an additive effect where you end up getting accumulation of all those prior injuries leading to either a prolonged recovery or quite possibly even permanent damage. Now you must be thinking, well, when is it safe for me to return to play then? Generally speaking, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for these energy levels to return to baseline. And then there's a minority of folks who still have symptoms past that period. And when that does happen, you can now be labeled with what's called post-concussive syndrome. If that sounds like you, that's where someone like myself comes in. There are numerous possibilities as to why you're this far out and yet still struggling with concussion-related symptoms. So through a comprehensive initial exam, it's my job to try and figure out which area or areas of your brain are not functioning as well as they should, and then come up with a tailored treatment plan specifically for those regions. So if that sounds interesting to you, head to my website using the link below, take a look at my calendar, and schedule a time for us to chat. During this time, I'll listen to your story and then share with you my thoughts on whether or not I think I can help, or if I'm not the right person, I'll try my best to point you in the direction of the person you should see. And this is entirely free, so I hope to talk to you soon.